Welcome to week 10 of Pub 500. This week we are starting a new unit where we will be talking about a new substantive policy area, and we are talking about a new policy theory, that of policy feedback theory. So, with that said, let's jump right in. Most of our theories thus far, in fact, most of this entire class, has focused on the way that policy is influenced by politics. What we are going to talk about this week is a theory that posits that policy influences politics, which then can also influence policy, creating a feedback loop. So we are kind of talking about visualizing this, and we'll fill in the gaps so that when we come back to this at the end, you'll see how all the facets of this come together. Now, the notion of a feedback loop means that each time you create a new policy or propose a reform, previous policies and the politics that they created attempts shape that activity. This means that the potential for policies to transform politics and as a result influence future courses of policy development. In other words, the notion that policy influences politics is key here, and then goes on to influence policy. In other words, policy is not just an outcome. Unlike the other theories that we've studied thus far, where the policy seems to be the outcome, and then maybe the refinement of it can circle back around, the policy is not just an outcome here, but rather part of this feedback loop. This comes from an article in 1993 written by Pearson, started as an article, later went on to a book, which talked about the fact that enacted policies shape political behavior through government elites, through organized interests, and kind of the mass public at large, really in two ways that we're going to dive into in a little bit. First is the interpretive effects, kind of sources of information and meaning that affect our political behavior, and resource effects. This is really just resources, money, time, etc., for certain types of political activity. The idea here is that policies can create these effects that then change political behavior. And so instead of the policy being the output, we can think of policy and political behavior as an output in the policy-making sphere. Your reading pointed out, and I think this is a good way to kind of break this down, 4 streams of policy feedback inquiry in the research: meaning of citizenship, form of governance, power of groups, and political agendas and definition of policy problems. I think this provides us a good way to think about the theory broadly and to talk about its constituent parts. So when we talk about meaning of citizenship, what we are talking about are the rights, duties, and obligations imposed by government, as well as citizens' responses to them, so their political attitudes and levels of participation. Public policies, believe it or not, actually affect membership in the political community. They do this either explicitly. Things like immigration and naturalization actually determine who is a citizen and who is not. But they can also affect standing in society. They can create a status that did not exist before, whether that is eligibility for a certain benefit policy like Medicare, or another type of welfare policy, or an idea of status that maybe exists outside of this, like veteran status. They can also create and alter identity because they can recognize certain people or fail to recognize others as legitimate. So, for example, the recognition of transgender as a protected class in equal opportunity law varies right now. It's actually even up for debate at the Supreme Court. So policies about how you create identity can fall into different camps. One can be you kind of outlaw that type of identity. So you make policies about transgender bathroom use that attempt to ban people's use of bathrooms that some people feel they don't fit their gender. Or you can make different types of policies that actually recognize citizenship by requiring maybe non-sex segregated bathrooms in certain circumstances. Just by thinking about where you situate a policy actually matters. If you're, say, criminalizing something, that's going to have a very different outcome on people's political behavior than if you are making a civil right or civil liberty available to them. So policy can affect the meaning of citizenship and how it is carried out. Policy can also affect and be affected by the forms of governance that are involved. Once policies are enacted, they may shape the policy alternatives that lawmakers have selected or maybe even considered because of the type of administrative arrangements that exist. So I want you to think about this for a minute. When is government seen as competent and when is government seen as incompetent? There are actually times, believe it or not, where government is seen as quite competent. And when they are seen as competent, we tend to see those agencies then overloaded with different tasks and laws to administer, which unfortunately often leads to them being incompetent because then they're overstressed. The idea here is that the politics that result from a policy either going well or going poorly affect the policy that we choose the next time around. So this can have a positive feedback where we see an agency doing well or an area of government doing well and we give them more to do, or a negative feedback where we limit the ability of certain organizations within the government or certain types of frameworks that we have found to be ineffective to exist in the future. We might, for example, do this with Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. There are proposals on the table to take them out of the mortgage industry as government-sponsored entities altogether. This would be in large part due to a negative feedback loop, saying that their existence as government entities that can be propped up by the Treasury and the Federal Reserve are actually detrimental to the public. At least that's one potential theory. But the idea here is that we are focusing on the types of arrangements that are useful, and that has a feedback effect, that once we see something being useful or helpful, it feeds into the next inquiry, and so on. This also may focus on the question of what's best for the public sector versus the private sector, and we've often pushed governmental functions into the private sector at various times because we have believed that government was incompetent in those areas. So I'm thinking of the post office functions or Amtrak, etc. We also might see the need to regulate previously unregulated spaces. So our net neutrality discussion earlier this semester is a good example of this. So the form of governance is one way in which you can think about policy feedback at work. Then there are some researchers that look at the power of groups and discuss the way in which the existence and growth or diminishment of groups is affected by certain policies. Once you have a certain policy, people think the groups tend to go away. Once you have an interest group get its way, the group just goes away, right? Well, we know that to not be true. In fact, what researchers that study within this policy feedback theory would argue at times is that the existence of a policy can actually lead to the existence and growth of certain groups. So, for example, a policy like the Affordable Care Act does not threaten private insurers and in fact might encourage the growth of private insurers or maybe even consolidation of private insurers. There is a good part of the reading that talks about how the organization, the AARP, came to be more powerful after the enactment of legislation centered on seniors, that they weren't just an interest group around for the passage of legislation, but actually became more powerful because the legislation was passed. So, instead of interest groups being merely a cause for new legislation, they might actually be the result of the policy itself. Now, after legislation occurs, these groups can become entrenched and can have interests that might make it hard to change the system, to change the status quo. And so group existence does not always mean success and may be viewed differently by different groups. Or we may view this differently. So, in other words, just because the AARP thrives after the enactment of Medicare, for example, does not mean that the existence of groups will foster the same type of goodwill after they have come about in different policy areas. Your reading talks about this with specific reference to women's groups and equal opportunity laws in the 60s and 70s. And then the final stream of inquiry we can think about within the policy feedback theory are political agendas and how we define policy problems. So this area of research, which is one of the areas of research I'm interested in, is how political agendas get defined. What is a private problem or a public problem? Do policies that are started by one political party get owned by them? For example, the Democrats and the Affordable Care Act. And then, how do we as a society view target populations for certain policies? So, people who receive food stamps, how are they viewed as a population when they are a beneficiary of a policy? Are they deserving or non deserving? That type of thing. There's a lot of research about this and how it influences future policymaking and political life as well. Because if you are part of a group that is negatively viewed, then how does that affect your participation within society? So I told you we'd come back to the feedback mechanisms, and here we are. We have looked at a couple of different ways researchers study this problem, but largely it comes down to these two different types of effects. That policy creates two different types of effects: resource effects and interpretive effects. Resource effects are literally resources that are at someone's disposal: education, money, time, etc. And the idea here is that having resources might allow people to overcome barriers to political participation. So if you give people money to go to school and get a college education, don't be surprised if that higher education leads to more voter turnout amongst that group and better mobilization for their needs. Examples of this are the things like the GI Bill and Pell Grants and so on. Now, some policies don't provide resource effects. The benefits that come from those policies just don't seem to materialize into political behavior or status. And your reading talks about FEMA benefits as one potential source of this. The idea here might be, and researchers are still looking at this, that there is an inherent impetus for political mobilization when you give someone money to get educated, and we know education is so closely linked to voting and political participation. Also, political organizations might be able to take advantage of this and kind of capture the attention of people who are beneficiaries. And so not all policies provide resources similarly. Now, on the other side of that, we kind of have a more nebulous term, which are interpretive effects. Interpretive effects are those rules and procedures, norms and values that influence our political activity. These may be fostered by resource effects that then lead to our feeling that we are able to influence government and government listens to us. It also might just be the ability of public policy to shape values and attitudes about people that leads them to participate or not participate politically. And we can think about how policies shape citizens' subjective experiences, how they individually feel, whether it's true or not, about the meaning of citizenship and their status, identity, and role in the political community. And this can be thought of in terms of external or internal efficacy. External efficacy is that a feeling of the government is responsive to people like me. So if the values that come about because of a policy make people think that the government is responsive to them, they might be more likely to politically participate. Internal efficacy means that people feel like they are capable of influencing government. So they might feel that as a result of something coming about due to mobilization they were engaged in, they are now capable of influencing government. Now, of course, different people are influenced differently depending on a multitude of factors, but one of those might be whether they're beneficiaries of policy or whether they are bound by regulation to stop doing something or refrain from doing something. And negative or positive experiences with policies might provide different views. So if you've had a positive experience with food stamp benefits, for example, SNAP benefits, your positive experience might lead you to have greater levels of external or internal efficacy, whereas a negative experience would potentially not bring about any change in those values or might bring about a decrease in those values. The idea here is you have kind of one solid block of resources that come from policy that can change people's ability to engage in political life, and one more kind of nebulous, value-based experience and attitudes that create norms about when people can participate. So then we can better visualize this feedback loop. So we have policies that influence politics. They create groups, identity, and values, and they give resources to people, sometimes quite literally, that lead them to engage in politics in a certain way. Maybe they drop out of participating in politics. Maybe they become more strongly entrenched in political activity. And they exist in this way because of the policy choices made here. Once the politics exist in a certain way, this influences how new directions in policy can come about. So groups may become entrenched. You may have values set by previous policies over here that now influence what you think is possible in the future. Certainly, could be argued to be the case with healthcare, that once we have relied so heavily on employer-based healthcare, it's hard to shift away from that because of both the policy in the past, but the politics that it creates as well. So that leads us to our discussion circles. And what I want you to focus on here, given our new topic of gun violence, is giving a rough description of what you think the feedback mechanisms are in place that are related to gun violence as a public policy issue. And I know that this often can be a kind of hot topic, but I want to think about it as a public policy issue. And especially with the growth of organizations like March for Our Lives, Everytown, and Moms Demand Action, why are those kind of taking greater hold these days against organizations like the NRA? What are the previous policy choices, and how have they created the political situation we're now in? And does that limit change? Are we limited by those past decisions? So I kind of want you to map it out a little bit. I don't expect this to be perfect, but I think it might be a good way to test out policy feedback theory and see if it works for you. I will post the discussion circle assignments. I'm only going to, I believe, do 2 groups this time and see how that works out. So make sure you take a look for your name there. All right, that's all for this week. Talk to you later.